Growing up in the remote wilderness of Alaska, Isabella Clarke's world was one of stark beauty and untamed wildness. Raised in a small cabin by her father, a conservationist and wildlife biologist, Isabella spent her early years surrounded by the sounds of nature. Whistling winds, the crackling of firewood, and the occasional howl of wolves echoing through the icy expanses. When Isabella was just 5 years old, a chance encounter would change the course of her life forever. On a cold winter's morning, while exploring the snow-covered forest near her home, she discovered a tiny polar bear cub. The cub, no older than a few weeks, had been separated from its mother. The blizzard had swept through the region, and its mother, likely disoriented, had not returned for her baby. Isabella's father, upon finding her cradling the cub in her arms, made the decision to care for it, at least until it was old enough to be released back into the wild. Isabella named the cub Aurora, after the breathtaking northern lights she had seen during the long Alaskan nights. With her father's guidance, Isabella learned how to care for Aurora, feeding her a special diet and keeping her warm in the harsh winters. Despite the immense size of the growing bear, there was a tenderness in their relationship, a bond between a girl and the creature who was once a helpless infant. They played together in the snow, and Aurora, though wild by nature, grew accustomed to Isabella's presence. By the time Isabella turned 15, Aurora had grown into a majestic polar bear, elegant and powerful. It was clear that the bear's time with humans was drawing to a close. Isabella's father, seeing the wild instincts of the bear surface more each day, began preparing her for the eventual release. When the day finally arrived, it was bittersweet. Isabella had spent 10 years with Aurora, and the thought of letting her go into the vast wilderness was heart-wrenching. But it was the right thing to do. Aurora's home was in the wild, where she could roam free and embrace her true nature. Isabella watched with a heavy heart as Aurora lumbered into the wilds of Alaska, disappearing into the snowy wilderness, a part of Isabella's heart following her. Years passed and Isabella grew into a young woman. She moved to Anchorage to attend university, pursuing a degree in environmental science with the hope of continuing her father's legacy. Life in the city was a far cry from the wild beauty of the Alaskan wilderness, but Isabella's memories of Aurora kept her grounded. In the quiet moments, she would often think about her beloved bear. Had Aurora survived? Was she thriving in the wild, just as she should? Isabella tried to find solace in the thought that, despite the separation, she had made the right choice. 10 years had passed since the day Aurora had wandered into the wilderness. But one cold, gray morning in her 30s, the letter was from an old friend, a fellow biologist who had spent years studying the polar bear population in Alaska. He wrote of a bear that had been spotted near a remote research station. The bear, large and powerful, had been acting strangely. The description was strikingly familiar. Could it be Aurora? Isabella felt a deep pull within her, an undeniable desire to know if the bear she had raised was still out there, alive, roaming the land she had once called home. Without hesitation, Isabella packed her bags, grabbed her gear, and flew back to Alaska. She was determined to find Aurora, to learn if the bear had lived to fulfill her destiny. After weeks of searching, Isabella found herself standing at the edge of a vast frozen tundra. Her heart raced as she gazed out over the endless snow and ice. There had been reports of sightings of a large polar bear, but the landscape here was unforgiving. It was easy to get lost, yet Isabella felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, as if the wild itself was guiding her forward. There, at the edge of a distant ridge, Isabella spotted a figure, a massive white form against the backdrop of the snow. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was Aurora. The bear, now fully grown, stood like a sentry on the frozen tundra, surveying the land. The years had passed, but the unmistakable gaze of the bear met Isabella's eyes across the distance. Aurora had survived, and she had thrived. Isabella's heart swelled with emotion, a mixture of joy and sadness. But there was something different about this reunion. As Isabella approached, she noticed a subtle tension in the air. Aurora's body language was stiff, her eyes wary. The gentle bear she had raised was now a formidable force of nature, and though their bond was real, the wild had reshaped her. Isabella took a tentative step forward, calling out to Aurora in a voice that was familiar, yet distant. But something had changed. Aurora did not approach, nor did she show the same affection that she once had. Instead, she watched Isabella with an intensity that felt unfamiliar. A strange silence filled the space between them. Isabella stood still, unsure of what to do. The connection they had shared seemed to be there, but it was clouded by the untamed instincts of a creature who had learned to survive in the harshest conditions. As the wind howled across the tundra, Isabella took another step forward, her hand outstretched. She called to Aurora again, but the bear's stance shifted, its eyes narrowing. It was as if something deep within the bear had awakened something primal. Suddenly, without warning, Aurora charged. Isabella tried to retreat, but the snow beneath her feet gave way and she stumbled. The massive bear was upon her in an instant, its strength and speed overwhelming. The force of the encounter sent Isabella tumbling to the ground, her cries lost in the roar of the wind. Aurora loomed over her, powerful and untamed. The years had transformed the gentle cub Isabella had known into a creature whose instincts were too wild to ignore. In that fateful moment, the girl who had once raised the bear found herself face to face with the raw power of nature. The bear paused for a brief moment, its gaze intense and uncertain. But nature, as it always does, had its own way. And in that final, unspoken exchange between the two, the bond they had once shared, no matter how pure, was now something of the past. Isabella, overwhelmed and outmatched, was unable to escape the force of the wild. In the aftermath of that fateful encounter, Isabella's body was found by the research team. Her journal, found nearby, told the story of a woman's deep connection with the wild, but also a stark reminder of nature's unyielding force. Aurora was seen again, roaming freely in the wilderness, her once familiar bond with Isabella now a distant memory. The bear, having fulfilled her role in the wild, continued to live, roaming the tundra, embodying the very essence of freedom. Isabella's story, though tragic, serves as a profound lesson. It is a reminder that nature, no matter how deeply we connect with it, operates on its own terms. The wild is a place of beauty, but also of untamed power. While we may love and care for animals, they are not ours to control. They belong to the land, to the forces that shape them, and to the instincts that drive them. And so, Isabella's legacy lives on in the wilderness she cherished. Her story is a tribute to the wild beauty of Alaska, to the bond between humans. Story 2? Story 2. In the remote village of Port Wyvern, nestled against the icy coastline of northern Alaska, 10-year-old Norah Ellington lived a life shaped by the rhythm of the Arctic. She was the youngest daughter of a family that had lived off the land for generations, skilled in survival and attuned to the harsh beauty of their environment. Life was simple but unforgiving, where every decision carried the weight of survival. One morning, while walking along the frozen shoreline with a basket of fish for her family's smokehouse, Norah spotted a peculiar lump near the ice edge. As she cautiously approached, her breath caught in her throat. There, half buried in the snow, was a tiny polar bear cub. Its fur was matted with ice, and its breaths came in shallow puffs that barely stirred the cold air. There was no sign of its mother. Norah hesitated. Her father had always told her that wild animals, especially predators, were best left to their own destinies. But staring into the cub's dark, pleading eyes, she felt a pull she couldn't resist. Against the practical voice in her head, she bundled the cub into her coat and hurried home, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. The Ellington household was initially divided over Norah's decision. Her father, James, was adamantly opposed to keeping the cub, warning of the dangers and the ethical dilemma of raising a wild animal. Her mother, Anne, was more sympathetic, recognizing the cub's dire condition and Norah's unwavering determination. "Just until it's strong enough to survive," Norah pleaded. Reluctantly, her parents agreed. She named the cub Arik, meaning protector in a local dialect. Caring for Arik became Norah's sole focus. She fed him fresh fish and goat's milk, slept beside him in a makeshift pen to keep him warm, and learned to interpret his various sounds and gestures. In turn, Arik grew stronger and more playful, following Norah around like an oversized, clumsy puppy. As the months turned into years, Arik grew into a formidable creature. By the time he was 3, he stood taller than Norah when he reared on his hind legs, his snowy fur glistening like the icebergs that drifted in the bay. Despite his size, Arik was gentle with Norah, a fact that often amazed and terrified those who witnessed their bond. Yet, even as their connection deepened, Norah knew Arik's place was not by her side. He was a polar bear, a creature of the Arctic, and he belonged in the wild. With a heavy heart, Norah and her family made arrangements to release Arik into a protected area, far from human settlements. On the day of his release, Norah walked him to the edge of the tundra. Tears blurred her vision as she watched him lumber away, pausing only once to look back, before disappearing into the endless white. In the years that followed, Norah's life took a new direction. She pursued a degree in wildlife biology, driven by a desire to protect the Arctic ecosystem that had shaped her upbringing. She studied the migration patterns of polar bears, their hunting behaviors, and the threats they faced from climate change. Yet, she often thought of Arik, wondering if he had adapted to life in the wild, and if he ever remembered her. Her work brought her back to Port Wyvern frequently, where she would venture into the tundra for research. These trips always filled her with a mix of anticipation and melancholy. Though she spotted polar bears on occasion, she never saw Arik. Perhaps it was better that way, she told herself. It meant he had fully embraced his wild nature. 10 years to the day since Arik's release, Norah embarked on a solo research trip into the tundra. The air was biting, and the landscape stretched in a blinding expanse of white. She was tracking the movements of a group of polar bears that had been spotted near the coastline. Armed with a notebook, a GPS device, and her father's old hunting rifle, carried more for peace of mind than any real intention to use it. She set out on her snowmobile. Around midday, Norah came across tracks in the snow. They were massive, larger than any she had seen before. Her heart quickened. Could it be Arik? She followed the tracks, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the icy landscape. Finally, she saw him. A colossal figure stood atop a ridge, silhouetted against the fading light. His fur shimmered, and the distinctive scar on his left ear, a remnant of an old injury, confirmed what her heart already knew. It was Arik. Norah felt a surge of emotion, joy, awe, and a touch of apprehension. She called out softly, her voice trembling. "Arik, it's me. It's Norah." The bear turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it seemed as though he recognized her. He lowered his head slightly, his massive body still and watchful. Norah took a cautious step forward, then another. But as she drew closer, she noticed a subtle change in his posture. His ears flattened, and a low rumble emanated from his chest. Norah stopped, her training kicking in. She knew the signs. Arik was not the playful cub she had raised. He was a wild animal, shaped by years of survival in a harsh and unforgiving environment. His instincts were not those of a companion, but of a predator. She tried to de-escalate the situation, speaking in a calm, soothing tone, and slowly backing away. But the dynamic had shifted. In Arik's world, this was his territory, and Norah was an intruder. The encounter was brief but harrowing. Despite her best efforts to diffuse the tension, the gap between their worlds was too vast to bridge. Norah's extensive training and experience in wildlife behavior were no match for the raw power and unpredictability of nature. When news of Norah's story spread, it resonated deeply with people around the world. Her life's work and the bond she had shared with Arik became a poignant reminder of the complex relationship between humans and the natural world. Norah's family and colleagues honored her by establishing the Norah Ellington Arctic Research Fund, dedicated to studying and protecting polar bears and their habitat. Her story served as a cautionary tale, illustrating the need to respect the boundaries of wildlife and the dangers of anthropomorphizing animals. The wilderness is a realm of beauty, power, and mystery, governed by rules that humans cannot rewrite. Norah's life and work remind us that true respect for nature lies in understanding and preserving its wild essence. not in trying to tame or possess it. Her bond with Arik, though extraordinary, underscores the importance of letting wild creatures remain wild, where they can thrive, as nature intended. As for Arik, he continued to roam the Arctic tundra, a testament to the resilience and majesty of the natural world. And though their final encounter was bittersweet, the bond they shared left an indelible mark on those who heard their story, inspiring a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between humanity and the wild. Story 3. In the icy vastness of the Arctic tundra, where the wind sang a song of solitude and the snow stretched to the horizon, 12-year-old Eliza Thornton made a discovery that would change her life forever. She was exploring near her family's outpost, a lonely cabin nestled against a backdrop of towering glaciers and endless white, when she stumbled upon a sight both heartbreaking and extraordinary. It was a tiny polar bear cub, barely larger than a husky pup, curled up in the snow. The cub was weak, shivering and alone. Eliza's father, an experienced Arctic researcher, had always taught her the cardinal rule of the wild: never interfere. But in that moment, her young heart overruled the wisdom of caution. The cub had no mother in sight and wouldn't survive the bitter cold on its own. "You're coming with me," she whispered, wrapping the fragile creature in her parka. She named him Seiku, the Inuit word for ice, and carried him home. Life with Seiku was as challenging as it was magical. The young polar bear grew quickly, his appetite for fish, seal meat, and milk seemingly insatiable. Eliza spent her days feeding, playing, and nurturing him, and though her father was wary, even he couldn't deny the unique bond between the girl and the bear. By the time Seiku was 3 years old, he was no longer the small, vulnerable cub Eliza had rescued. He had grown into a powerful and majestic animal, his paws massive, his white coat thick and gleaming. It became clear that Seiku was no longer a creature that could safely live alongside humans. Though it broke her heart, Eliza knew the time had come to let him go. On a somber spring morning, Eliza and her father loaded Seiku onto a snowmobile sled and traveled to an uninhabited region far from human settlements. She hugged the bear one last time, her tears soaking into his fur. "Be safe, Seiku," she murmured as he loped off into the tundra, disappearing into the wilderness that was his true home. For years afterward, Eliza dreamed of Seiku. She imagined him thriving in the Arctic, a king among polar bears, his strength and instincts guiding him through the icy expanse. 10 years passed, and Eliza, now 22, had followed in her father's footsteps to become a wildlife biologist. Her passion for Arctic conservation had grown alongside her curiosity about the very creatures she studied. She dedicated her work to understanding the behavior and migration of polar bears, advocating for their protection in a rapidly changing climate. It was during one of her research expeditions that Eliza's story took an unexpected turn. She had ventured deep into the Arctic Circle, alone, to track polar bear populations. Equipped with a snowmobile, GPS, and survival gear, she navigated the frozen landscape, collecting data on bear tracks and hunting patterns. On the second day of her journey, Eliza came across something extraordinary. A set of tracks, larger than any she'd seen before. The massive paw prints led across the ice, and they stirred a memory long buried in her heart. Could it be Seiku? She wondered, her breath catching in the frigid air. The idea seemed impossible. Polar bears lived solitary lives, and the chances of encountering the same one after so many years were slim. But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling. Driven by a mix of curiosity and hope, she followed the tracks for hours, her excitement building with every step. As the Arctic sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in hues of gold and pink, Eliza finally spotted him. In the distance stood a bear, unlike any she had ever seen. He was enormous, his presence commanding, his white coat glowing in the fading light. But it wasn't just his size or majesty that struck her. It was the scar on his left ear, a small, crescent-shaped mark he'd gotten as a cub when he tumbled on the ice. "Seiku!" Eliza whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She called his name softly, her voice carried by the wind. The bear turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. Eliza's heart swelled with joy and nostalgia. Against all odds, she had found him. But as she took a step forward, something shifted. Seiku's body language changed. His massive frame tensed, his ears flattened, and a low rumble emanated from deep within his chest. Eliza stopped in her tracks, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. Eliza had spent years studying polar bears, understanding their behaviors and respecting their instincts. She knew that despite their past bond, Seiku was no longer the cub she had raised. He was a wild animal, governed by survival and instinct, not memory or emotion. She knelt in the snow, making herself appear smaller and less threatening. "It's me, Seiku," she said softly, her voice trembling. But the bear's instinct was stronger than any recognition. In the years since his release, he had thrived in the unforgiving Arctic, learning to view humans as either competitors or dangers. The encounter escalated quickly. Eliza tried to back away, her movements slow and deliberate. But Seiku's reaction was swift and overwhelming. The line between human and animal, between memory and instinct, had been irrevocably crossed. Eliza's story became a profound reminder of the complexities of human and wildlife interactions. Her passion for the Arctic and her love for its creatures had inspired countless others to care for the fragile ecosystem. Though her life ended in the wild, she loved so deeply. Her work continued to make an impact on conservation efforts worldwide. Seiku remained a figure of legend among the Arctic researchers who heard her story. Some believed he symbolized the raw power of nature, a reminder of its beauty and its unpredictability. Others saw him as a testament to the importance of keeping wildlife wild, allowing creatures to live as nature intended.